Today's webinar is sponsored by Phreesia, the choice of leading healthcare organizations. Phreesia's innovative platform leverages self-service to transform the patient intake process, enabling healthcare organizations to more effectively deploy their staff and dramatically improve the patient experience. Visit Phreesia.com to learn more. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Are You Prepared? Protecting Your Healthcare Organization from Emerging Privacy and Security Threats. My name is Maureen McKinney, and I will be the moderator for today's session. The presentation will last approximately 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. I encourage all of you to ask questions at any time during the session using the questions box located on the control panel on the right side of your screen. I'll ask as many questions as time allows, and then we'll pass along any remaining questions to our speaker, Mac McMillan, and we will send his answers to attendees in our post-webinar follow-up community. And since it's always one of the most frequently asked questions, we are recording this webinar, and it will be made available to all attendees later this week, along with a copy of the slide deck. Now I'd like to briefly introduce today's speaker. We are very fortunate to have Mac McMillan, co-founder and CEO of Synergistic, a firm specializing in information security and regulatory compliance in healthcare. Mac is the current chair of the HIMSS Privacy and Security Policy Task Force, and he has nearly 4 decades of combined intelligence, security countermeasures, and consulting experience in both the government and private sector. And I'm sure he'll have lots of valuable insights to share with us. With that, I will turn it over to our speaker. Mac?
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to our discussion today. It's a pleasure to be here and to do this for the folks at Phreesia. You have to excuse me a second. There we go. So our topic today is protecting your organization from cyber attacks. And I think that everybody today has obviously been paying attention to what's been going on in the news and around the industry, and knows that this is an absolutely extremely interesting time to be in healthcare as it relates to cybersecurity. And so we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the nature of those threats that we're seeing today and how those things are occurring to give you a better understanding or appreciation for that threat. And then we're going to talk about some of the things that organizations need to think about doing, some of which we can do in-house ourselves, and others that we need to think about in terms of technology or services that we're going to have to consider going forward if we're going to be successful at combating what we're being faced with today. I'm not going to go over our company. The only thing I would say that's unique about us is that I started this company back at the end of 2003, and we decided at that time to do 2 things really well, and we've stuck to that for the last 14 years, and that is, 1, whatever our core competency is with respect to privacy or security or audit, and then secondarily to understand the healthcare space. And so our customers are 100% healthcare related. They're either hospitals, clinics, physician practices, in other words, providers, clearinghouses, health insurance organizations, or now vendors, business associates that work with health organizations and provide services to them or handle their information or their information systems. So it's a pretty wide array of organizations, but they all have one thing in common, and that is they're focused on providing services within the healthcare space and handling patient information. We talked about my background, so let's get to today's topic. Again, we're going to talk about the changing nature of the threat that's out there, and then a little bit about how to respond. So I don't think this is something I need to spend a lot of time on for anybody in this audience, but I think it's always useful for all of us to come back and realize what we're all about. And this is one of the things that I go around, I give about 120 presentations a year around the country, and webinars, and write various articles and pieces for folks. And the one thing that most of the audiences that I'm speaking to are folks in the IT space and in the information security space. And the thing that I always want to bring those folks back to center on is why we're in this in the first place, and it's really about taking care of patients. Information security and IT are literally support functions in what our industry is all about, which is actually helping people to get healthier. And there's some things about our industry that have actually made this whole problem that we have today, or challenge that we have today, much more difficult. And the first one, of course, is the nature of innovation in healthcare. We are constantly seeing new IT devices, new products, new services, new ways of doing things popping up and being introduced into our delivery system that is creating more challenges, more access, and just creating new opportunities from a security perspective or a privacy perspective that we have to address. That also comes with complexity. We have literally hundreds of thousands of applications out there today, everything from wearable technologies to handheld technologies to applications that run in our systems and in our back end and our data centers. And all of these things have to work. They have to work very seamlessly, and we have to be able to secure the data that's traversing all these different applications and being accessed by all these different people in order to be able to be used effectively. And that too is creating its own set of challenges. Cost is always an ever-present pressure that we have in healthcare. As all of you know, I know in spades, we're being asked to do more with less. We're being asked to figure out how to reduce costs. At the same time, we're trying to do amazing things with systems and amazing things with data, and unfortunately, that creates new requirements for security, and it creates new risks and new opportunities out there that we have to address. And then last but not least, one of the biggest reasons that healthcare has become such a target today is this whole issue of convergence. And that is that healthcare, different and apart from all other industries, actually brings all of the different types of sensitive information that's relative to a person together in a single place. And if you think about it, we have our patients' health information, we have at times their personal information, we have their credit or financial information, and most of the time we have all of this on one network or in one system or in multiple systems on one network. And we have all this information today digitized, as opposed to in the past where a lot of that information used to be in hard copy. It is now much more accessible, and it's much more easy to steal large amounts of data if we're able to compromise and exploit a network or a system that has this information. So it makes us a bigger target, and I'm going to show you how that actually plays into some of the things that we're seeing in the threat environment that actually accentuates that issue, if you will, for us. Why should we care about this? Well, I hear all these things all the time. We need to care about it because it's part of healthcare. We need to care about it because it's the law. Actually, the real reason I think we need to care about it is because the security issues that we're seeing today, the cybersecurity events that we're seeing today, are absolutely affecting our business. They're undermining our intellectual property by stealing that information. They're undermining the brand of a lot of our healthcare institutions who have found themselves in situations where they couldn't provide services and were subjected to public scrutiny with respect to those incidents. It's undermining our mission, meaning our ability to actually develop and deliver patient care in an effective and safe manner. And last but not least, it's affecting or threatening, if you will, patient care and safety in the process. And those are things to me that, quite frankly, are far more important than all the laws, all the regulation, all the other things that are out there. Because at the end of the day, our primary mission is to take care of people. Our secondary mission is to have a successful business. And we can't do that if we can't trust our systems and our data, the things that we're relying on to be able to deliver those services. Cybersecurity today affects all aspects of our business. It affects us strategically, meaning when we have cyber events, it can undermine the goals of the organization and things that we're trying to achieve. Operationally, it affects us when somebody gets knocked offline or loses access to their data or is incapable of communicating. It absolutely affects their ability to operate. None of this stuff is free. None of this stuff is cheap. Every time there's an incident, there's a cost, even if the cost is just internal in terms of the amount of time that we waste responding to it and trying to recover from it. Obviously, compliance is always an aspect out there that's ever present. But last but not least, this reputational issue is becoming much more prominent than it was in the past. And I'll give you an example. When we talk about the Hollywood Presbyterian situation out in California, or the Titus Regional down in Texas, or the Hurley Medical Center incident up in Flint, Michigan. These are all organizations that absolutely suffered some level of reputational damage as a result of the cyber incidents that they experienced. When your hospital or your clinic or your facility gets taken offline and you're not able to deliver services, and you have to begin to send or turn patients away and send them across town to other institutions, and somebody puts a camera in somebody's face with a microphone and they start talking about how terrible it was that their daughter sat in the emergency room for X number of hours before they were finally dismissed because they couldn't take care of them, or why their 84-year-old grandmother had to go across town to get her prescription filled because the hospital that she'd come to rely on no longer could support her, etc. Those things absolutely impact our reputational image. And in fact, one of the things that was talked about after a couple of those incidents was the fact that the reputation that we most often think about is, of course, the reputation with our patients. But in fact, one of the other reputational hits that occurred as a result of those particular incidents was the reputation of the physicians themselves, and how the physicians and the clinical staff viewed their hospital, meaning those folks said, I've got choices as to where I'm credentialed and where I work and where I bring my patients, and I need a hospital that I can count on, or a clinic that I can count on, or a company that I can count on that's actually going to be there, have my data, and be able to support me and support my patients. So it was a big issue. So let's talk about those threat changes. This is a little bit of a busy slide. It's actually simplified, believe it or not, but it actually shows you the escalation of hacking and cyber threats that we've seen in the last 7 years since the advent of high-tech and meaningful use in 2009. And that really was the turning point in this industry. Prior to 2009, we had incidents that occurred, but for the most part, they were incidents that involved physical theft or loss of information, not so much cyber threat. After 2009, and when meaningful use came to play in the HITECH Act, and we started digitizing all of our information, and we started introducing other things like HIEs and accountable care, etc. All of a sudden, we had more people touching our data, more data out there in other places. Our supply chains expanded greatly, meaning we now today, for instance, have 30 to 40% of our services being supplied by somebody outside the hospital or outside the clinic or outside the doctor's office that are actually providing a service back to us as the caregiver, and doing that and handling our data and handling certain systems for us. And what that has done is it has just exponentially increased the footprint of healthcare as it relates to that patient information. And as a result, we've seen a real uptick in the amount of cybercrime that's been directed at healthcare as a result. What's interesting, though, is that when you get to 2014, and that time frame, 2013, 2014, we actually began to see another change, and that is we began to see different types of attacks. So we weren't just seeing attacks for the purpose of stealing information, but we began to see attacks for the purpose of extortion. We began to see attacks for ideological reasons or causes, and we began to see attacks that were just plain disruptive, which is a big difference. And so the four basic types of attacks that we see today are geared towards either financial crime, espionage of some sort, hacktivism, which is ideological, and then advanced persistent threats, which are the most serious attacks that we see. So let's take a look at each one of those. But before we do that, let's talk about how we've seen the actual attacks themselves evolve as well. So you can see this chart is pretty detailed in terms of what goes on. You notice that if you go back a few years ago, we had a lot more nuisance type attacks and data theft attacks as opposed to today, where we're seeing much more cybercrime and hacktivism and destructive. And unfortunately, we've actually gotten to a point now where a lot of these attackers, if they aren't successful at stealing the information or extorting the money or are successful at whatever their initial plan of attack was, they'll actually revert to a destructive attack that's actually very disruptive to the business, and in the long run, in some ways, maybe even more costly. Why are they being so successful today? Well, number one, cybercrime is an actual business. There are actually cybercrime as a service model out there, and we're going to talk about the dark web and how you can actually literally hire a cyber criminal to perpetrate hacks for you and help you to steal information. Because of the dark web marketplaces that are out there, it's very easy to monetize this information now that we have it. The dark web is very much like the Amazon, if you will, in terms of shopping. And I'm going to actually show you a couple of sites that you can see where you can literally buy just about everything you want, everything from types of attacks to somebody to run them for you, to renting a botnet that you can use for running attacks, to certain types of information that you want in particular as a cyber thief, so that you don't really have to even know how to do this anymore. You just have to know how to get to the dark web, be able to use the Tor network or the Onion router network, which allows you to be anonymous and to be able to encrypt your communications and have a Bitcoin account so that you can actually transact business out there in an anonymous fashion as well. We're seeing cyber criminals today very much act like businessmen, meaning we're seeing, for the threat centers that monitor the different types of attacks that come at our health organizations, are actually saying that they're now seeing patterns where the attacks pick up on Monday morning and increase all the way through Thursday afternoon, and then start to drop off on Friday. And then, of course, it's the weekend, so the hackers take the weekend off just like you and I do, and then they come back to work on Monday and they go back right at it. And so we're actually seeing an entire industry, if you will, rise up within the dark web that's actually conducting these attacks on a regular basis, and we're actually seeing the patterns in terms of traffic that support that. I talked about the monetization of this data. Medical records are much more valuable than any other type of information that's out there today, primarily because they can be used over and over again. They can be used for multiple purposes. The information is not perishable, so I can't just give you a new medical history. Your history is what it is. I can issue you a new credit card number. I can put a second factor out there on accounts that use your Social Security number and better protect that. I can put protection around your email accounts, etc. But once I have your medical record and I have all of that information, I can use that to set up use it for fraudulent ID purposes to get services. I can use it to establish a fraudulent site for submitting fraudulent claims. There are all kinds of things that I can do with that information, and I can do it over and over and over again. I talked about the dark web, and I talked about having a Bitcoin wallet or Bitcoin account and good encryption, and then utilizing the Onion router network for communications. And what you see here on the slide are these are actual sites from the dark web, where if you can, I know it's probably difficult to see here, but you're going to actually get these slides so you can blow them up a little bit and look at them. And one of them is a slide is a marketplace for requesting hacking services. So if you want to hire somebody to hack something for you or help you with that or teach you how to do it, One of them is a site for educational purposes so that you can actually go to school and learn how to do this stuff. And another one of the sites is a marketplace for actual types of information. So if you want personal backgrounds, if you want credit histories, if you want credit card numbers, etc., it's all out there for you to shop for if that's something that you're interested in. I would obviously suggest that you. One of the things that I will stop here and as a caveat and say to you, don't go to these sites on any computer that's connected to your home network that perhaps you communicate with your bank on or that you do shopping on, or any computer that's connected to your business. Oftentimes, when you connect to these websites, as you know from just a marketing perspective, when you connect to a website, a lot of times they give you a cookie that they download onto your system so that they can remember you and they can send you advertisements, etc. Well, the problem with the dark web is that sometimes when you go out to the dark web and you access some of these sites, instead of giving you a cookie as a present, they actually give you a piece of malware as a present and then hijack your system. So whatever you do, don't do that on a computer that's connected to anything important. So let's talk about those four types of threats real quickly. So the first one that we're seeing quite a bit of right now in healthcare is cyber extortion. Most of it is happening through ransomware attacks. There are two different forms of ransomware. One that attacks systems and locks up the system and denies the individual's access to the system itself. And the other is a CryptoLocker variant that actually encrypts the data and makes the data inaccessible. They've gotten a heck of a lot more sophisticated about this than what they used to be. Now they don't leave shadow files on the disks anymore. They use very strong encryption with respect to what they're doing, so it's almost impossible to break. They use encryption with respect to their communications, and they use the Onion Router network in order to communicate. And so it's very hard to track these people. It's very hard to catch them, if you will, and very hard to break what they've done. They are indifferent to the target. If it makes you feel any better, they're not necessarily targeting you. They're targeting everybody, and that means everybody from your home computer, your child's game console, to your work computer. And a lot of families, unfortunately, have had their home computers hacked or hit with ransomware, where the attacker will encrypt all of their family photos and their music or their movies, etc., and then ask for a ransom in order to get the key to unlock that information and get it back. So it's important that we not only secure our work environment, but that we secure our home environment as well, in terms of how we set up those routers that communicate back to the internet, and how we set up our computers that are behind those routers in our homes. These kinds of attacks come at us not just from the internet through things like malvertising, meaning malware that's attached to legitimate advertising sites, but also through email attacks, attachments to emails, downloaders. When somebody goes to the web and downloads something and it executes on their computer, as well as things like botnets that are literally computers attacking computers, and are sitting out there in the wild and literally running thousands and thousands of attacks an hour, because that's all they're doing. And it's kind of almost like a Terminator scenario, where you literally have computers attacking other computers on the internet. And then last but not least, a lot of these attacks come through social engineering. They come through things like phishing attacks. They come through attacks through Facebook, LinkedIn, other social media sites that you might use either personally or in your business, that a lot of times the attackers will find a way to compromise or mimic a legitimate site on LinkedIn or on Facebook, if you will, to get you to click on it. And then once you do, you downloaded the malware, and they're off and running. Cyber espionage. is another form of cyber crime that is really picking up in healthcare. Most of this is state-sponsored. Most of this is focused on really large organizations, as you see here with Anthem and Premera, Community Health, and UCLA, where they're stealing millions of records, and they're not necessarily stealing it to monetize the data itself or stealing it for identity theft purposes, but they're really stealing it to understand better our society, understand better our level of health care and the health of our general population, as well as information about healthcare in terms of intellectual property. So new procedures, new medicines, new techniques, etc. It's much, much easier for me to steal that information if somebody's not protecting it properly than it is for me to spend the millions of dollars or billions of dollars and the number of years it would take to develop it myself. So this is another form of crime, cybercrime that's going on out there that is affecting healthcare, but is not necessarily directed right at healthcare. Hacktivism, you've all seen this face, I'm sure, somewhere along the line. You probably saw it with respect to the movie V for Vendetta. This is the face of Anonymous, one of the most infamous and largest hacking groups that's out there. They actually involve themselves in hacktivism as opposed to hacking for criminal pursuit, if you will. In other words, they're not out there stealing data for identity theft purposes, for instance, but what they're doing is attacking organizations that they feel have engaged in something that, from a societal perspective, is unacceptable. So, for instance, in 2014, Anonymous attacked Boston Children's Hospital because they detained a young woman in a parental custody battle that the State Department decided to get involved in, where the father was outside the United States and the young lady was in the United States. And Anonymous decided that the federal government should not be involved in parental rights cases, and told Boston Children's to either release the child back to her father or they would take the hospital down. They gave them 3 days to do it. They didn't do it. At the end of the third day, Anonymous took that hospital to its knees, and it literally could not communicate with anybody, even within the hospital or outside the hospital. And they held that hospital hostage for 3 days before they released it. They were also responsible for the attack on Hurley Medical Center earlier this year. Hurley Medical Center, you may or may not know, was involved, at least tangentially, in some of the information, I guess, relative to the water situation in Flint, Michigan. And for whatever reason, Anonymous decided that made them a viable target for their attack. And so when Anonymous went after all of the different organizations in Flint, Michigan that they felt were somehow complicit or involved or at least knew about the water situation, et cetera, because they were involved in either treatment or research or whatever with respect to that issue, they actually perpetrated a very sophisticated zero-day virus attack against that hospital, and in very short order infected almost 2/3 of its systems, and Hurley was down for the better part of 6 to 7 days while they cleaned up the damage to get back up and running again. And then the last issue there is something that we all kind of never suspected, which was certain pro-ISIS groups have actually hacked various websites across the country and in other places to use those as platforms to present or to distribute propaganda with respect to ISIS. And so there have been several hospitals that have had their websites defaced and rerouted to a pro-ISIS site where pro-ISIS propaganda comes up when the patient or whomever goes to that hospital's website looking for information. So it's not doesn't necessarily put anything at risk in terms of the data, but it certainly is a big nuisance for the hospital and something that obviously nobody in the healthcare business wants somebody to see when they go to their website. And last but not least, we have what we call targeted attacks, or APTs. And targeted attacks or APTs are attacks that are persistent in nature. They're very sophisticated. They typically are attacks that are after something very specific. These are the attacks where people are the attacker is the most diligent and the most patient in terms of how they do that. In most of these attacks, the attacker is inside our environment for a long period of time before they actually perpetrate the attack, whatever that is, whether it's a ransomware attack or whether it's a destructive attack or whether it's stealing information. But they typically find some way into the environment. They do their reconnaissance. They get control of the network. They begin to shut down certain security features so that they won't be discovered, and then they manipulate the environment to do whatever it is that they're trying to do. And we're seeing more and more of these kinds of attacks, and more people who, when they actually do proactive forensic analysis, begin to find that they've been hacked 6 months ago, 8 months ago, whatever, and the attacker is still in their environment. What are our vendors doing with our PHI? You know, there was just another case that was reported today of a vendor who unfortunately was going out of business and decided that it was going to destroy the hospital's data after it gave them back a raw copy of the information. And of course, a legal battle ensued, and there was a restraining order issued to make sure that information was not destroyed until the organization that was receiving it back could verify, in fact, that they had the data that they were getting back was, in fact, all of the data, and it was usable, etc. But we don't really know what a lot of our vendors are doing with our information, and we need to have a better handle on that. And a lot of our covered entities are beginning to ask a lot of those questions in terms of what level of security do you have on your environment? How often do you test? Who tests your environment? What security framework are you using with respect to your program? And this is just one example where Uber, which, as you know, is one of our new transportation type companies that's out there, they were actually tracking the people who were using their system to include all of their financial information, and they were putting that information out into GitHub in unprotected stores. They had a couple of incidents that occurred. One, a reporter who was going there to interview some of their executives who, when she got out of her Uber vehicle at their headquarters, was greeted with, "There you are, we were tracking you." And she was kind of dumbfounded that they were actually able to do that with her. You know, and then they had the breach with GitHub that occurred. Since then, there have been new security requirements levied on them by the settlement that they reached with the New York State Attorney General. But it basically begged the question that everybody needs to ask, which is, do we really know what they're doing with the information that we're sharing with them? Juniper Networks is another example of a vendor out there who a lot of us relied on for firewalls and other network devices in our environment, who was affected by the Edward Snowden disclosure with respect to the weakness in the AES dual elliptical curve encryption, and they were supposed to have stopped using it, but in fact they didn't stop using it, and it wasn't until just recently when a couple of researchers actually discovered that Juniper had never changed that encryption algorithm on those systems, and for literally years had put customers at risk as a result of having network devices in their environment that were absolutely subject to compromise. And then last but not least, unfortunately, our insider threat has not gone away. We still have a tremendous amount of information that is lost through insiders who engage in inappropriate activity, identity theft, sharing of information, selling information, not protecting information properly. And it's something that we tend to, as the cyber crimes kind of rise up and get more attention, we tend to forget about the fact that that it's not just about the data, it's not just about the system, but it's also about people as well. And there needs to be a good balance between how we approach this and the education and awareness that we give our users, so that one, they don't make mistakes, and two, so that they understand what they can and can't do with the information that they have access to, and that we have a better handle on what they are actually doing. All of that combined kind of comes back to us in the sense of how do we manage the business, and how do we manage the difference between what security tells us we probably ought to be doing, which is typically a ceiling, if you will, or a best practice, and what compliance is telling us we have to do, which is often a floor or a minimal requirement. And the answer for most of us is really somewhere in the middle. And we need to do a better job of finding that spot where we have the right amount of security to protect the business and protect the data and protect our patients, and at the same time we will accommodate compliance as a byproduct of doing that. But simply going after compliance will not get the job done anymore. And organizations that just focus on compliance, just focus on some certification or some regulatory mandate, are going to find themselves the victims of cybercrime, because they typically, compliance regulations or compliance requirements, etc., don't cover all the things that we have to do from an information security perspective to truly protect the environment or the network and the data. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing we do is we become more knowledgeable about the threat itself and understanding how attacks happen, the fact that people are out there doing reconnaissance on us on a daily basis. In fact, since December to March of this year, we've seen a 10-fold increase in the number of probes for ransomware on our networks in healthcare, meaning the organizations that actually track the traffic that hits our websites has said that in December we had 3,000 attacks a day to where we are in March, where we have 30,000 attacks a day. They then go through an entire process of weaponizing their attack, delivering the tools that they need for doing that, exploiting our network, installing things, in creating a command and control capability, and then finally exploiting our environment and doing whatever it is they're doing. How do we fight that more effectively? First of all, we need to employ a security framework that is more of a complete information security approach to how we manage our environment. Frameworks provide a taxonomy for a lot of very useful purposes, but most importantly, it allows us to actually measure the effectiveness of our controls, which is ultimately what we need to do to manage risk. We need to take a holistic approach to data security as well. We need to be able to identify where our assets are at and where they're most at risk. We need to make sure that we apply the right protections. We need to have the right capabilities for detecting the bad guys and what they're doing. We need to be able to respond effectively, and last but not least, we need to have real effective and real meaningful recovery strategies. One of the things that we saw in a lot of the breaches this past 6 months, where folks had significant downtime, was that where they fell down was in the detection, response, and recovery side of the equation, meaning they didn't detect the attack soon enough, it overpowered them, and then they didn't have the ability to actually respond or recover effectively, and so it caused downtime. How do you get there? You get there through governance and having a program that actually says, I got to have steps for each one of these things and controls that map to them. Next thing we need to do is we have to realize that we have to take the fight back to the bad guys. We can't just let them continue to attack us without responding. We need to educate our people, make them smarter about what to look for, how not to be the victims of phishing, if you will. We need to remain current within our environment, get rid of old systems, antiquated hardware that can't be patched or fixed anymore, and the information systems that we have in our environment need to be kept up to date. They need to be hardened, they need to be patched regularly, and they need to be managed smartly. We need to deploy two things. One, we need to continue to deploy security as in a layered effect, meaning that we have integrated types of controls that are doing different things at the endpoint, in the back end, across the network, etc. But we also need to deploy what we call complementary controls, meaning things that not only look for known signatures of bad guys, which is typically how those systems work, but things that actually look for anonymous or anomalous behaviors as well. And that's probably the most important thing today to fight cybercrime. And that is to enhance our detection with these new technologies that give us that capability. Things like next generation firewalls, advanced malware filters, antivirus systems that have a heuristic capability associated with them, and intrusion detection, intrusion protection systems that actually are tracking the traffic that's coming at us and that's moving across the wire. That's what's going to help us, one, recognize these things faster, isolate them, and eliminate them before they cause real damage in our environments. And then once we've done that, we have to have the ability to respond and recover. And that's where we really need to rethink a lot of our contingency planning. A lot of organizations have gone to asynchronous backups with respect to their environments, where they have a primary data center and then they have a backup data center, and the data actually moves from the production environment to the backup environment literally within seconds. We've now seen attacks where the bad guys get in, they establish themselves, they figure out how we're doing things, they encrypt the backup tapes first, or the backup site first, then they come back and encrypt the production environment, and all of a sudden it's game over. Because even if we have our data backed up somewhere else in a third place, like on tapes or whatever, we may not necessarily have a third physical location where we can actually rebuild. And so, and even if we use one of those two primary ones, it's going to take us longer. So do we really have realistic contingency plans that actually approach this problem from a worst case scenario? Or are we actually thinking that if our primary site fails, that our backup site's going to save us, and we really haven't thought through that yet? And then last but not least, we need to be ready and we need to be objective in our analysis, meaning we have to exercise, we have to have those relationships that are necessary to help support us when these things occur, and we need to have somebody, a third party, that's actually testing our environment and telling us that we're doing a good job. And that all starts with that risk assessment. And this is kind of a silly cartoon, but the fact of the matter is there's nothing that tells us more about our environment than a true risk assessment. Now, this is not a controls audit. There are lots of controls audits that are out there and certification programs that will go through a set of requirements and conduct an audit of whether those controls exist or not. That's not the same thing as a risk assessment that says, I don't care that you have a control. What I want to know is how effective is that control at mitigating risk. That's what a risk assessment does for us, and that's what we need to perform. Once we've done that and we understand what it is we need to do, we need to make sure that we have a smart defense. We need to make sure we do that blocking and tackling that I talked about earlier. And we need to understand that when you look at the breaches that occurred last year, 99% of them occurred as a result of a hacker exploiting a vulnerability that was in existence for more than a year, and in many cases more than 5 to 6 years. What that means is there was a patch available, or there was a configuration that could have been had, or there was a segmentation response that we could have adopted that would have avoided that risk, and those things weren't done. We need to prepare. We need to make sure that we're exercising. We need to make sure that we have all the things in place that help us to prepare for breaches, and if we're going to have cyber insurance, which is a useful component of our security program, we need to make sure that it's going to cover the incidents that we have, and that it's going to provide us with support for forensics and other types of things that we need. Then we need to organize and we need to practice. You're not going to respond to these things effectively, just like any other fire drill, if you don't practice for them ahead of time. So what happens during an attack? What are the phases of an attack? What are the things that I need to be able to do? And can I do those efficiently and effectively? And are the people that are designed or scheduled to do those things, do they know what they're supposed to be doing? And discipline is very important in security. Now, this is another very involved slide, but hopefully it's one that you guys can take away, and it's very useful because it actually takes you through a Boolean logic process of what do I do during when I have a breach and I'm actually conducting that risk assessment to determine what I need to do from a notification purpose. This also helps us document that process in a very consistent manner. And as I said before, don't forget the minions. Don't forget the people. It's very important that we actually enhance the level of training and awareness that we have out there for our workforce, for our IT staff, for our incident response members, for our executives, our board, etc. And by all means, start using new approaches that focus on interaction. What we have seen is that organizations that use exercises and tabletops fare much better when they have issues. And last but not least, elevate the discussion to the board and to our executives. Make sure that security and privacy is something that we discuss as a business, because it is a business issue. And if we don't do it well, it will absolutely become a business problem or a business opportunity. So with that, I think I'm just about done here. But I think, just like the Great Wall in China, which never did what it was intended to do, which was to protect China from the great hordes on the other side, we need to rethink how we do security and privacy in healthcare, and we need to understand that a lot of the approaches in the past are just not adequate for today, and we're going to have to accept that and figure out what it is we need to do a better job now. So what can we expect in the future based on what we're seeing right now? We can expect that there are going to be more social engineering attacks that target people because they've been very successful. The Internet of Things that you haven't even imagined, things like your washing machine, your smart TV, your refrigerator that's connected to the network, etc., your HVAC system at your clinic or your hospital. Those are all modes of attack today to get into the network because they're connected to the network. Ransomware will continue to be successful in targeting healthcare. We're going to see more attacks in the medical device and wearable technology space as well, as those things become more and more prominent. And last but not least, we're going to see cybercrime as a service continue to grow because less sophisticated actors and cyber criminals are beginning to realize, hey, I can actually buy this. I don't have to understand how to do it anymore. Here are some useful resources for you. You can go through those when you get a chance. And with that, I'd like to turn it over for questions.
Thank you so much, Mac. That was a really great presentation. I know everyone really enjoyed it. We're going to open up for the Q&A portion of this session now. As a reminder, you can use the question box on the bottom right to ask any questions, and I'll get to as many as I can. We've got a good one to start, one that just came in from the audience. Thanks for a great presentation, Mac. Can you give some examples of interaction in awareness training?
So one great example is phishing exercises. So there are services now where companies like ours, for instance, that will actually run phishing exercises for you. That when the user receives the phishing email, if they click on it, if they don't recognize that that's what it is, and they click on it, they will instantly be taken to a very short training session that's usually no more than 5 or 10 minutes that basically takes them through a process of saying, here's what you just clicked on a phishing message, here's what you should have done, here's what to look for in the future. And so it's immediate feedback. It happens in real time. It's a real thing that they engage with on their work computer, and it provides immediate education for them. Typically, those services also provide reports to, obviously, management with respect to how well the organization did. And in addition to that, one of the things that we do when we work with organizations to do these is we always recommend to them that they have both a rewards and an education approach to this, meaning reward the ones who actually identify the phishing message and don't click on it. At the same time, you provide education to the ones who fall for it, and don't make it punitive, but make it part of your awareness program. And what we find is that organizations that do that and do it on a recurring basis, we see the numbers of incidents where people actually fall for those things drop off dramatically.
Great, thank you. We've got another good question. I've been reading a lot about virtualization technology and an ongoing debate about whether or not it adds a layer of security to existing systems, particularly with regard to things like ransomware. What are your thoughts on virtualization?
So virtualization is not necessarily a solution for a ransomware attack, because typically what happens in a ransomware attack is the attacker finds a way to download the malware onto your environment, or to get a hold of a set of credentials that gives them access to the environment to where they can then download their malware. And the malware actually attacks the file structure itself, or attacks the servers themselves, or the databases themselves. And so virtualization, for the most part, is really ineffective in terms of fighting ransomware directly. It tangentially can help, because it may be that there is less accessibility by the user through the virtual display, such that they can't, they may not have the ability to download certain things or execute certain things out of temp files and that sort of thing. But it's not generally something that we use to fight things like ransomware directly.
I have another good audience question. We're a smaller organization. We don't have a lot of extra resources. Who should own this process? Do we need to have a dedicated security employee? Who do you recommend oversee this process in our organization?
That's a great question, and one of the things that I like, if we're talking about a physician practice or physician practices or small clinics, I almost liken those businesses to the same as other types of professional businesses, like small community banks, CPA firms, etc., and in small law firms. And in most cases, those folks don't try to own that function. They typically look to outsource that for themselves, so that they can take advantage of somebody else who is providing that as a service, and in many cases can actually provide it more economically than they can actually hire people to do it. So, if you're large enough that you can afford to hire someone, the problem with security is that you almost can't hire somebody who's going to be a Swiss Army knife that can literally do everything that you have to do from a security perspective. And so there's a point, I think there's a breaking point where from a financial perspective as well as from a security perspective, there are benefits to looking at a managed service as opposed to trying to do it in-house. Certainly when we get to a certain size, it may be actually a combination of those things. But even very large organizations, there are certain functions that are performed in security that they don't try to do themselves. Things like log monitoring, IDS management, SIM support, etc. They actually have service providers who do that function for them, because even they don't have enough resources or the expertise to do it as well.
Great. Another question, how frequently should I conduct employee training? And here's an interesting part that they added on. Should we also train our employees in how to address the media and things like reputation management in the event of an attack?
Again, two great questions. So to the first question, what I would like you to do is change your approach to education. What I mean by that is this. In the past, the traditional approach to educating users was you have a new orientation process that somebody gets when they come on board, and then there's typically an annual refresher, and for the most part, that's the formal education that we see. What we're finding is that that's really not adequate, and it's really not effective, that people just don't retain that well enough for it to really be effective in helping us to combat these things and have that level of awareness that we need them to have. Organizations that actually break their training down into small snippets that they deliver routinely across the year in multiple venues, whether it's posters, whether it's email messages, whether it's newsletters, whether it's staff meetings, etc. But take that security education and break it down into very practical and periodic reminders. Tend to have much higher levels of awareness and tend to do much better in terms of their users, helping them to maintain their security posture. And then the second part of that question, I'm sorry, help me again with the second part.
Yeah, of course. The question was just, should we include training about, how to address the media or reputation management in just regular training?
So, sure. So absolutely, for those employees, particularly people in public affairs, people in executive positions, people in security, people in compliance roles, depending on your size, right? If it's a practice, then your practice administrator, etc. You absolutely ought to give them that training, because I guarantee you, when something happens, whether it was the physician practice that was I think it was up in Illinois that went through a ransomware attack, and the administrator had a microphone stuck in her face and a camera, and the news media wanted to know what was going on and how was this affecting their patients, and et cetera, et cetera. And if you have not had that experience, first of all, not everybody is comfortable in that environment. But number two, it is very helpful to have some level of training or exposure to what that feels like and what that process is, and some training with respect to how to do that effectively before you actually do it. And it can be incredibly important to the business, because one misstep in front of the press, you can't get it back. Once it's on the 6 o'clock news, it's out there. Or once it's in the newspaper, it's out there. So you absolutely want folks that are going to represent you, for sure, to be comfortable in front of a camera, to be comfortable in an interview, and to understand what's important to say and how to say it, and to absolutely think about that before it actually occurs.
Great, Mac. We've got time for one more question, and again, as I mentioned, if we have questions that we don't get to, then we'll pose those to you and direct those to attendees in follow-up communication. But time for one more on the line. How about some tips for setting up internal network segregation? Do we mostly use firewalls, or are there other methods?
Great. Another great question, and that's a great question for two reasons. Not just the reason you asked it for, but primarily because when I tell people to think about segregation or segmentation of their network, think of segmentation like being on a battleship in the Navy, right? One of the reasons that when the Navy goes out to fight wars on the open ocean, that the ship doesn't sink when it's hit by the first torpedo, is because that ship is segmented. It's a series of compartments. And when the torpedo hits that aft compartment and starts to flood, the captain of that ship says, shut down compartments X through Y. And they do that, and they stop the flooding so that the ship doesn't go down. Think of segmentation in the same way from a breach response perspective. If I have my network segmented properly, and I have the ability to literally sever parts of the network from the rest of the network, or shut them down, break those connections when an attack occurs, if I can identify where that attack is and isolate it quickly and sever that portion of the network, I can reduce the amount of effect or damage that attack is capable of doing, and I can shorten the amount of time and lessen the amount of effort that is involved in that response and recovery process. How do we do that? Well, segmentation can be accomplished through multiple different ways, but real segmentation occurs typically when we have our network broken down into various VLANs, if you will, that virtual LANs that are protected either by true access control lists, or ACLs, or some form of firewall. And it can be, there are now segmentation firewalls out there that that are not the classic perimeter firewall, but a firewall that has been developed specifically for segmentation purposes. But in addition to that, one of the other things we need to pay closer attention to is how we configure and secure the network devices that permit the flow of traffic in our environment as well, such that I don't have routers or switches that are sitting out there that don't have passwords that are encrypted on them, that have default settings open, that are not locked down, etc. If I have the right type of segmentation and I have the right level of integrity around my network devices, the attacker's problem in terms of exploiting my network becomes exponentially harder. And those are things that I can do right now that quite frankly don't necessarily cause me a lot of cost in terms of dollars. They do, however, have a cost associated with them with respect to administration. So certainly the more segmentation that we have in our environment, the more administrative overhead that we're going to see with how we configure things and manage access and users' privileges, etc. But in the end, it is far better to deal with that than it is to deal with a situation where a zero-day attack gets loose in our environment and literally propagates across the network because we're flat and we have no segmentation or no protection.
Thank you, Mac. I know we could keep going for a long time. We've got a lot of questions that we could ask you, but I think we're out of time, and again, we'll pose any extra questions to you later. I wanted to thank you for a great presentation. Thanks to our audience for all of the great questions that you posed as well. We hope all of you enjoyed today's webinar and found it to be informative and beneficial. And later this week, you'll receive an email sent to the email address you used to register for the webinar that will contain the presentation documents and a link to the recording. We'd also love to hear your feedback, and we ask that you kindly complete the survey that will follow the webinar. And please visit Phreesia.com or email us at info.phreesia.com to learn more about how Phreesia transforms patient intake. That concludes today's presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.